Today's story is downright horrifying and would make you consider on how you raise your kids if you got kids. And if you don't have children, then today's story will make you consider if you even want children. But before we begin, if true crime stories intrigues your interest, then I highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do. And if you do subscribe, then you can expect a new video every week. But with all that being said, let's begin. Our main character in today's video is named Daniel Petric, or by his nickname Danny. Danny was your average American kid that you would see in American movies. He was born on August 24th, 1991 to the Petric family. His friends and family would describe him as a normal and happy child that was exceptionally kind to everybody. His family consisted of Susan Petric, the mother of Danny, who was 43 years old, her husband Mark Petric, and their two younger daughters, Heidi and Holly. The family would grow up in a small town called Wellington, Ohio, and the town was actually quite small because, well, there was only about 5,000 people living in the town, and well, since this was a small town, there really wasn't much to do. Even though there wasn't really much to do, the town was known for its nature and the fact that you can go on many different walks. And also this fact you should probably keep in mind because it will come into play later on in the story. Anyways, Danny's upbringing was very good. Both of his parents worked. His mother would work at a nursing home that was actually in Wellington, and his father would work as a Pentecostal minister, which was basically, from what I found, was someone who does religious things like christening and other religious stuff. So both parents were working, so that did mean that Danny and his sister would grow up having everything that they wanted. And of course, in turn, this would mean that the family would have an amazing relationship with each other. And this also meant that they rarely argue with each other. The family was also very religious due to the fact that both of Danny's parents were strict Christians. And so for many years, things in the Petric household would be quite peaceful. During his school time, Danny would be known as the quiet kid that never really spoke to anyone unless they spoke to him first. But of course, the more years that passed in school, the more he became into an extrovert, and in turn he made more friends. But when it came to partying and other hedonistic things, a lot of the time Danny would just pass on that due to the fact that he was developing a love for his religion, but also during his school years, and also due to the fact that, again, his town was so small, there was nothing really much to do. Danny would find a big passion for video games. Things would start normal for Danny and video games. He would casually play once or twice a day and only for like an hour, but things would turn for the worst, as Danny would get a spinal injury that would really hinder his abilities to move around. He got this injury during his holiday, where him and his family would go to a ski resort, and it would be there where he fell and hurt his back. And when the family came back home, he found out that he wouldn't be able to move around properly for a whole year. And so quickly Danny found himself pretty bored, and the only way for Danny to cure this boredom was to play video games. And slowly things would go from playing once or twice a day to playing every day and for multiple hours straight. And before his injury, Danny didn't really like violent video games. He thought that kids shouldn't be allowed to play these type of games. But ever since he got that back injury, his feeling towards video games changed, and also his opinions on them. And now he was fully devoting his time to playing these video games. And as he kept on playing more and more, he began to play more and more violent video games, as he thought that they were more fun compared to the less violent games. And if you do like video games yourself, you know what game came out on that year. And if you don't know, well, it was Halo 3. And Danny and his friends bought the game pretty early and began to play it religiously. And if you don't know what Halo 3 is, it's a first-person shooter game that when it came out, it blew up massively. There were multiple modes such as campaign mode, which was where you'd play by yourself through a story. But the main mode that popularized the game was called multiplayer mode, where, from what you could probably guess, it's where you play with other people. And so many kids like Danny would hop onto multiplayer mode and would play with their friends. And Danny would play Halo for 8 hours straight every day. This of course would concern his parents, not because of how long he was playing, because they understood that he really had nothing else to do, but it was the fact that the game that he was playing was very violent. And Danny's parents knew that Danny wasn't a fan of violent video games, so all of a sudden, for him to play a violent video game for multiple hours straight made no sense to them, and in turn made them more concerned about Danny. And in a way to keep him in check, Danny's father would ban him from playing Halo. But to their horror, Danny would just leave the house and would go to his friend's house to play Halo there. And also the fact that he didn't even care about his bad back, And at this point, Danny's parents knew that Danny was addicted to playing Halo. As Danny's parents began to punish Danny more and more for his behaviour and the lack of willingness to let go of Halo, the more and more worse Danny's reactions would become, to the point where there was significant tension in the Petric's family home during October 2007. And it got to the point where Danny's father would give Danny an ultimatum: either you stop playing Halo or you can move out. And well, if you've learned anything from this video, you'll know that Danny chose Halo. So he would pick up his stuff and would move to his friend's house. And of course, since Danny had no parental figure, things would get much worse. And if you thought playing 8 hours a day was bad, Danny would manage to surpass that 8 hours a day, to the point where him and his friends were playing up to 18 hours a day. And well, of course, his friends' parents would become more concerned of his friend's well-being and would ask Danny to move back home, because there was no way they were letting their son do that. And when Danny moved back home, he was instantly told by his dad about the boundaries that has been set. And unfortunately for Danny's father, Danny was willing to test these boundaries. Since his first copy of Halo was taken away from him, he would one day sneak out from his bedroom window and would head to his local GameStop, where, you guessed it, he would pick up another copy of Halo. And when he got back home, he would just play it behind his father's back. But it wasn't long before he would actually get caught by his father, and as expected, a massive argument would ensue. After shouting for what felt like hours, Danny's father would take Danny's second copy of Halo and would keep it in a safe where there was no way of Danny finding it or even getting it in the first place. And Danny's father would hope over the next couple of days Danny would calm down and would come to the realization on what he was doing and how his actions are affecting the full family, and maybe if he was lucky enough he might get an apology. So on October 20th 2007, just a couple of days after their massive argument that they had, Danny's father and mother would wake up and things would go normal for them. And since it was a Saturday, the two could just lounge about and do nothing for the full day. Their daughter Heine would leave the house early in the afternoon and would arrive back home in the evening time so they could watch the baseball match. So skip some time and it was around about the evening time, and both Danny's parents would gather around the TV, and well, the two would wait for their daughter to come back home so they could watch the game. But to their surprise, they would see Danny, who had only been leaving his room every time his parents would go into their room or go out, and Danny would walk down the stairs with his hands behind his back and would tell them in a cheerful voice, "I've got something for you." And both parents would look at each other because they were pretty confused, and they also thought that he was still angry at them for taking away Halo, but they thought he must have just cheered up and realised his mistake. So his parents would smile back at him and would tell him, "What do you have for us?" Danny would reply back quickly and would say, "It's a surprise, so I need you to close your eyes." Both parents were still a bit shocked with how Danny was reacting and how he was responding to his parents, but they were happy that Danny had calmed down, so they're happily obliged, and they would close their eyes. So once their eyes were closed, Danny would walk around the back of the couch where they were sitting at, and he would go behind Danny's father's back first. And as Danny's father was listening as Danny was walking behind him, he began to get more excited and of course more curious on what Danny was going to surprise him with. And so he would jokingly tell Danny to hurry up because he needs the toilet. But instead of getting a response, all he would hear was a metallic click and then a gunshot. Danny had just killed his father, and when his father's head went limp, he would aim the gun at his mother and he would shoot her as well. During those days where Danny was hiding himself from his parents, he would religiously try and find the passcode to his dad's safe, and somehow eventually he would find it. And so he would open the safe up and then would notice that the game was there, but not just that, his father's handgun was there as well. And of course his original plan was just to take the game and then just play it behind his father's back once again. But with the fact that his anger towards his parents was still at an all-time high, he would decide to change his plans and would take the gun. Then he would make both of their parents lower their guards by of course making them cover their eyes. And once he got in close range with his parents, it was just a point-blank shot. But there's just a slight but though. Even though when Danny shot his mother, she would die instantly, surprisingly Danny's father would still be alive. And to Danny's dismay, Danny's father would begin to roll around the floor, making groaning noises. And as Danny's watching his father clenching onto the little life that he still has, he would hear a knock at the front door. And to Danny's horror, it was his sister, Heine, who had just came back home from a little outside time. And at first, Danny would ignore the first knock that Heine would do. But when she knocked again, Danny would tell her that, "You don't want to come in." And of course, Heine was a bit taken aback and also surprised. And she would ask Danny, "Why not? What's going on?" And then Danny would reply back by saying, "Mother and father had a big argument." And as Danny said that, Heine could hear her father's moaning, and so in a panic she would scream at Danny to open the door. And even though Danny didn't want to open the door, he would oblige and he would open the door. And without a second wasted, she would just push past Danny and would see the absolute horror that was unfolded. Danny would use this opportunity to run away, as he felt like there was nothing more he could do. And of course he took his Halo game with him. Shortly after, Danny left in the family van and he would begin to make his way back to his friend's house to of course play another game of Halo. But that would never be the case, as the police would find Danny while he was en route and of course would arrest him. Danny would go on to claim while he was being arrested that his father shot his mother, and to keep himself safe he would run away, and this obviously would be a last ditch effort to claim his innocence, but of course they would go by deaf ears. Danny's mother's body would be examined and it would turn out that Danny had shot her 3 times, one on the chest, one on the head and one on the torso. His father, as you know, would fight for his life, and when paramedics finally arrived at the Petric's house, he would instantly be rushed to the hospital, and for a while doctors thought that they had saved Danny's father's life. But unfortunately a couple of hours later he would tell the doctors that his head was feeling numb and then he would slip into a coma. But somehow after a couple of weeks later he would wake up, and at first he was a bit confused on what happened, but when he was informed on what happened to him and what Danny had done, he was so angry to the point where he would tell everybody around him that he's going to shoot Danny the first chance he gets. Danny, on the other hand, while he was getting interrogated on the day he committed his crime, he would make up this elaborate and sad story. It would go by Danny saying, "I was sitting in my room and then randomly my dad would just start yelling and screaming at my mom. Then my dad walked into the bedroom and a couple of seconds later he would walk back out, and then a couple of more seconds later all I heard was gunshots. When I ran into the living room all I saw was my mother on the floor, deceased. And when my dad turned around and saw me, he would point the gun to my head and then suddenly he would say sorry and then would shoot himself." And of course the police would bring this story to his father and his sister as well, and they would obviously deny that to be the case. So the police would go back to Danny and would tell him that, "Look, we know this story is a lie, just tell us the truth." Once they told Danny that, he would take a deep breath and he would finally confess on his gruesome attacks. Danny would go to court with a face of guilt and would receive 23 years behind bars. Originally they were looking to give him the death penalty, but from what I read I'm not sure why they didn't. But either way he would be eligible for parole in 2030. Danny's father would have to learn everything from walking to using his bodily fluids, and of course he would have to learn that his dear wife was killed by his own son. And still to this day Danny's father regrets Danny from ever playing violent video games. So that'll be it for today's video. If true crime stories intrigues your interest, then I highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do. And if you do subscribe, you can expect a brand new video every week. But with all that being said, thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.